Sofia Petrenko had always been different from the other kids in her small Ukrainian village. While they played soccer in dusty fields after school, she sat at her grandmother's old upright piano. The instrument itself was nothing special. Some keys had yellowed with age and a few stuck when pressed too hard. But to Sofia, it might as well have been a grand piano on a concert stage. Her love for music started early. As a toddler, she would stop whatever she was doing whenever she heard melodies from the old radio her father kept in the kitchen. By age 4, she was picking out simple tunes by ear on her grandmother's piano. By 7, she was creating her own little songs. "That girl has something special in her hands," her grandmother would tell neighbors. She would know. In her youth, she had been a promising pianist herself before family needs and the hard realities of village life put those dreams aside. Now, in her granddaughter's small fingers, she saw a second chance. Sofia's parents worked hard just to keep food on the table. Her father drove a delivery truck, often gone for days at a time hauling goods across the country. Her mother cleaned houses in the nearest town, taking the early bus each morning and returning home late. They weren't poor by village standards, but piano lessons weren't exactly in the budget. Still, when Sofia turned 8 and her talent became impossible to ignore, they found a way. An old music teacher in the village agreed to give her lessons once a week in exchange for help around his house, sweeping his porch, weeding his garden, organizing his cluttered music sheets. By 10, Sofia had surpassed what the village teacher could offer. She practiced for hours every day after school. Her homework finished quickly so she could get to what she really cared about. The piano bench became more familiar than her bed. "You need better teaching," her grandmother said one evening, watching Sofia struggle with a particularly difficult passage. "Your wings are getting too big for this nest." It took 6 months of planning. Sofia's parents put aside a little money each week, cutting corners wherever they could. Her father took extra driving shifts. Her mother cleaned one more house. And when Sofia turned 12, they told her their plan. "You'll take the bus to Kharkiv every Saturday," her mother explained. 4 hours there, 4 hours back. The conservatory has agreed to let you study with one of their junior teachers." Sofia hugged her parents so hard they laughed. "Not so tight. Save that strength for the piano." The bus rides became Sofia's second home. Leaving before sunrise every Saturday, she'd watch the village disappear behind her and the larger world open up ahead. She did her homework under the dim overhead light as the bus rumbled along potholed roads. Some passengers became familiar faces: a woman who sold vegetables at the city market, an old man who visited his daughter each weekend, a college student with headphones who always nodded hello. The junior teacher at the conservatory, Ms. Belikova, was strict but kind. "Your technique is raw," she told Sofia on their first meeting, "but there's fire in how you play. Let's build a proper fireplace for that flame." Those Saturday lessons were worth every bumpy mile of the journey. Sofia would return home with her head buzzing with new knowledge, new challenges, new pieces to master. During the week, she practiced until her mother called her to dinner, and often after with a blanket stuffed under the piano to muffle the sound so she wouldn't wake her parents. Word spread in the village. Sometimes neighbors would make excuses to visit in the evening, hoping to hear Sofia play. Her grandmother would smile proudly and offer them tea while Sofia, somewhat shy about the attention but eager to share her music, would play whatever she was working on that week. "That child is going somewhere," the neighbors would whisper, in a place where most young people either worked the land or left for factory jobs in bigger cities. Sofia's talent shone like a strange, beautiful light. When Sofia turned 15, the conservatory held its annual student recital. Though not officially a student of the main program, Ms. Belikova insisted Sofia participate. "You'll play Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor," she announced during one of their lessons. Sofia's eyes widened. "But that's a piece for advanced students." Ms. Belikova nodded. "Exactly." For 2 months, Sofia worked on nothing else. She practiced the thundering chords until her arms ached. She refined the delicate middle section until it sounded like water flowing between rocks. On the bus, she would close her eyes and play the piece on her knees, feeling every note in her imagination. The day of the recital came. Sofia wore her only good dress, carefully ironed by her mother the night before. Her hair, usually in a practical ponytail, had been arranged in a neat bun. She looked older than her 15 years as she walked onto the small stage of the conservatory's recital hall. What Sofia didn't know was that among the audience sat Professor Abramovich. visiting from the National Music Academy in Kiev. He had come to scout potential scholarship students and was already bored after sitting through a dozen performances of varying quality. Sophia sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. From the first powerful chords, something in the room changed. The audience, mostly parents and relatives who had been politely attentive throughout the afternoon, suddenly sat up straighter. Even the sleepy younger sibling stopped fidgeting. As she reached the piece's middle section, Sophia forgot about the audience. She forgot about the unfamiliar piano. She even forgot about the holes in her best shoes that she'd colored in with black marker before leaving home. There was only the music speaking through her fingers. When she finished, the silence lasted just a heartbeat before the applause burst out. Sophia, suddenly shy again, gave a quick bow and hurried off stage. She didn't notice Professor Abramovich watching her with intense interest. Didn't see him leaning over to whisper something to the conservatory's director. 2 weeks later, Ms. Belikova called Sophia's parents. "There's an opportunity," she said, her voice crackling over the village's unreliable phone line. "A full scholarship to study at the National Academy in Kiev. Room, board, everything." Sophia's mother gasped. Kiev was nearly 500 kilometers away. Sophia had never been further from home than Kharkiv. "It's a chance that comes once in a lifetime," Ms. Belikova continued. "Professor Abramovich says he hasn't heard such natural musicality in years." That night, Sophia's family sat around their kitchen table long after dinner had been cleared away. Her father's face was serious, her mother's eyes worried. "You would be so far from us," her mother said, reaching for Sophia's hand. "But so close to your dream," her grandmother added softly. Sophia looked at the calluses on her fingertips, earned from thousands of hours at the piano. "I'm scared," she admitted, "but I think I'd be more scared not to try." Her father nodded slowly. "Then you must go." The next 2 months passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Forms were filled out. A small suitcase was packed and repacked. Neighbors came by with small gifts. A hand-knitted scarf, homemade cookies that would survive the long journey, a photo frame for her new room. The day before Sophia was to leave, her grandmother took her to the old piano one last time. "Play for me," she said simply. Sophia played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, her grandmother's favorite. When she finished, the old woman's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You carry all our hearts with you," she said, placing her weathered hand over Sophia's. "But when you play, you belong to the music." At 17, Sophia found herself in Kyiv, a city that seemed impossibly large and loud after her village. The National Academy was both terrifying and thrilling, filled with talented young musicians from all over Ukraine and beyond, all driven by the same passion. Initially, some of the other students looked down on her provincial background. They had studied at specialized music schools since they were little, had parents who were musicians or professors, had grown up attending concerts in proper halls. Sophia had learned on an old upright piano, and had heard most famous compositions for the first time through scratchy recordings. But when she played, the whispers stopped. Her technique might have needed refinement, but there was something in her interpretation that couldn't be taught. A depth of feeling, an authenticity that caught everyone's attention. "You play from somewhere real," her new teacher, Professor Abramovich, told her. "The others play from their heads. You play from lived experience." Sophia worked harder than she ever had before, making up for lost time. She was often the first to arrive at the practice rooms in the morning, and the last to leave at night. Her fingers grew stronger, her understanding of music theory deeper, her repertoire wider. And then, just as she was settling into her new life, the letter arrived. She had been selected to participate in Classical Stars of Tomorrow, a prestigious televised competition judged by some of the world's most renowned classical musicians. For the semifinals, she would perform before Vladimir Kostrov, a legendary Russian pianist and conductor whose temperament was as famous as his artistry. The opportunity was both thrilling and terrifying. Sophia called home with the news, the excitement in her voice carrying across the distance. "We're so proud," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. "The whole village is talking about it." As she hung up the phone, Sophia felt a strange mixture of joy and fear. She was no longer just the girl from a small Ukrainian village with big dreams. Now she was a serious contender, about to play on national television for one of her childhood heroes. Sophia squared her shoulders and headed back to the practice rooms. There was work to be done. The television studio was nothing like Sophia had imagined. In her mind, it would be like a concert hall, hushed, respectful, with soft lighting. Instead, it was a maze of cables snaking across the floor, bright lights hanging from metal frames, and people with headsets rushing back and forth, speaking in urgent whispers. 10 minutes until we're live, someone called out. Sophia sat in a small waiting room, hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling. She wore a simple blue dress her mother had helped her choose during a video call. Not too fancy, not too plain, her mother had said. Something that shows you respect the occasion but doesn't try too hard. A makeup artist had earlier dusted Sophia's face with powder, for the lights, she'd explained, and fixed a stray strand of hair. Sophia had never worn makeup before and kept resisting the urge to touch her face. Next to her sat her teacher, Professor Abramovich. He'd insisted on accompanying her, for which Sophia was deeply grateful. In the 3 weeks since she'd received the invitation to the competition, they'd worked on her piece, Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, until she could practically play it in her sleep. "Remember what we discussed?" Professor Abramovich said quietly. "Kostrov can be difficult. Don't take anything he says personally." Sophia nodded, though her stomach tightened. Vladimir Kostrov wasn't just a judge, he was a legend. His recordings of Chopin's complete works had been her constant companions during those long bus rides to Kharkiv. She'd watched grainy videos of his performances on her old laptop countless times, studying the way his hands moved, how his body language changed with the music. "Miss Petrenko?" A young woman with a clipboard appeared at the door. "We're ready for you." The main studio was even more intimidating, a circular stage with a gleaming black grand piano at its center, surrounded by tiered seating for the audience. Cameras on long booms swung silently overhead. The lights were so bright that Sophia could barely make out the faces in the audience. And there, already seated in the judge's chair, was Vladimir Kostrov. He looked both exactly like and nothing like his album covers. His once black hair had turned completely silver, brushed back from a high forehead. His face was more lined than in the photos, but those piercing blue eyes were unmistakable, eyes that seemed to see through you, that had stared out from Sophia's bedroom wall throughout her childhood. The host, a cheerful woman with a practiced smile, guided Sophia to the piano. "Just ignore the cameras," she whispered, which immediately made Sophia hyper-aware of their presence. As she took her seat at the piano bench, adjusting it slightly, Sophia felt rather than saw Kostrov's gaze on her. She risked a quick glance in his direction. His expression was unreadable, his posture relaxed but somehow commanding. The host moved to center stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Classical Stars of Tomorrow. Our next contestant is 17-year-old Sofia Petrenko from Vesele Village, currently studying at the National Music Academy of Ukraine in Kiev. She will be performing Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 under the evaluation of our guest judge, the world-renowned pianist and conductor, Maestro Vladimir Kostrov." A red light blinked on one of the cameras. They were live. Kostrov leaned forward in his chair. "Young lady," he began in heavily accented English, "I understand you've prepared Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2? Sophia nodded, her hands still folded in her lap. "Yes, Maestro." "A bold choice," he continued, one eyebrow raised slightly. His voice carried the weight of authority, deep, slightly rough around the edges. "Perhaps too bold. This piece has humbled pianists 3 times your age and experience." The studio fell silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. "It requires not just technical skill, but a mature understanding of its structure, the balance between the gypsy-inspired Lasan and the Friska," Kostrov continued. "The contrasts, the playfulness beneath the virtuosity." He made a dismissive gesture with his hand. Most young pianists approach it as merely an athletic challenge, a chance to show off their fingerwork. Sophia remained silent, unsure if she was expected to respond. "Tell me, how long have you been studying piano?" Kostrov asked. "Since I was 4, Maestro," Sophia answered, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "And with proper teachers," Sophia hesitated. "I had a teacher in my village until I was 12. Then I studied in Kharkiv on weekends. I've been at the National Academy for 2 years now." Kostrov's expression suggested this confirmed some private theory. "I see. And this piece, how long have you worked on it?" 6 months, Maestro." He gave a short laugh. 6 months. It took me years to truly master this piece, years of study, of understanding not just the notes but the cultural context, the historical significance. He turned slightly toward the audience. Liszt himself was such a virtuoso that his performances were said to cause women to faint. People checked his piano for mechanical devices because they couldn't believe what they were hearing. Sophia's fingers curled slightly against her knees. She'd read all this in her research about the piece. Nevertheless, Kostrov concluded with a theatrical sigh, "We shall see what provincial training has produced. Please begin." Sophia took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. The familiar cool touch of ivory steadied her. She began the dramatic opening chords of the Lassen section, trying to put the cameras and Kostrov out of her mind, to find that place inside where only the music existed. She had barely played 30 seconds when Kostrov raised his hand. "Stop, stop!" Sophia's hands froze above the keys. "You're racing through it like a child eager to finish a hated task," he said. "This introduction should breathe. It's a lament, not a sprint." He rose from his chair and approached the piano. "May I?" Sophia nodded and quickly moved aside as Kostrov took her place. His large hands settled on the keys with the confidence of someone returning home after a long journey. "Listen," he said, and began to play the same passage. Under his fingers it transformed. Where Sophia had played the notes correctly, Kostrov played them meaningfully with subtle shifts in timing that made the music speak in a different language. "You see? It breathes. It lives." He stood and gestured for Sophia to return to the bench. "It is not merely notes on a page. Try again." Sophia's cheeks burned as she resumed her position. She was acutely aware of the cameras capturing every moment of this correction, of the audience witnessing her shortcomings exposed by a master. Still, she recognized the truth in his criticism. She began again, trying to incorporate what she'd just heard. This time she made it a bit further before Kostrov interrupted. "Better, but your left hand is too dominant in measure 16. This piece requires perfect balance," and so it continued. Sophia would play a section only to be stopped, corrected, sometimes demonstrated to. With each interruption, her confidence crumbled a little more. The piece she had played flawlessly in rehearsal just that morning now felt foreign under her fingers, as if the keys had been rearranged when she wasn't looking. "Perhaps in your small village this would impress," Kostrov said after a particularly fumbled passage. "But this is a serious competition." Sophia bit her lip, fighting the burn of tears behind her eyes. She could see Professor Abramovich in the wings, his face tight with concern. She thought of her parents, who had probably gathered their neighbors to watch the broadcast. Of her grandmother, who had given up her own musical dreams but had nurtured Sophia's. After several excruciating minutes of this public lesson, the host finally stepped in. "Perhaps we should let Miss Petrenko play the piece through without interruption, Maestro." Her smile remained fixed, but there was a note of tension in her voice. Kostrov waved his hand dismissively. "What would be the point? It's clear she's not ready for this piece. It would be like asking a child to recite Shakespeare before they've mastered the alphabet." A murmur ran through the audience. This was going beyond the usual tough criticism expected in such competitions. Even for Kostrov, known for his exacting standards, this seemed excessive. Sophia sat with her hands in her lap again, staring at the keyboard. The beautiful instrument that had always been her refuge now loomed before her like an instrument of torture. The studio had fallen completely silent. Even the camera operators and production staff stood frozen, uncertain how to proceed. The host looked helplessly toward the producer, who made a cutting motion across his throat. "We'll take a short break," the host announced quickly. "Please stay tuned." As the red light on the camera blinked off, Sophia remained seated, unable to move. She felt hollowed out, as if something essential had been scooped from inside her. It wasn't just the criticism, she'd faced that before. It was the public nature of it, the deliberate humiliation. Professor Abramovich hurried to her side. "Sophia, don't listen to him. He's being unnecessarily cruel." "But he's right," Sophia whispered. "I'm not playing it well, because he's thrown you off balance. That's a tactic, not a teaching method." A production assistant approached them nervously. "We'll be live again in 2 minutes. The director says to try to keep it moving forward." Professor Abramovich looked like he wanted to argue, but instead squeezed Sophia's shoulder and returned to the wings. Sophia took a sip of water from a glass someone had placed beside the piano. As she set it down, a strange calm settled over her. Perhaps it was simply that she had nothing left to lose. The worst had already happened. She had been humiliated on national television by her musical hero. What could be worse than that? As the camera's red light blinked back on, Sophia raised her head. Something had changed in her expression. Where there had been nervousness, now there was something else. Not confidence exactly, but a quiet determination. "Maestro Kostrov," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "May I play something else?" Kostrov raised an eyebrow. The studio remained silent, cameras still rolling, capturing every moment of the unscripted drama. The legendary pianist studied Sophia with renewed interest, as if seeing her properly for the first time. "The competition requires you to perform your selected piece," he said, his voice cooler than before. Sophia's hands rested lightly on her lap, no longer trembling. "Just one piece," she persisted. "Then I will return to Liszt." The host looked relieved at this potential resolution to the uncomfortable situation. She nodded encouragingly from the edge of the stage. The producer, visible just beyond the lights, made a circular motion with his finger. "Keep going." Kostrov seemed to consider the request, perhaps sensing an opportunity to appear magnanimous after his harsh critique. His reputation was built not just on his musical genius but on his unpredictable temperament. He enjoyed being the center of attention, the master who could make or break careers with a word. "Very well," he finally said with a slight shrug. "One piece. A short one." Sophia nodded her thanks. She straightened her back and rolled her shoulders slightly, as her first teacher had taught her years ago. Her hands hovered above the keys momentarily as she closed her eyes. Finding her center, then, without announcement, she began to play the opening notes of Sergei Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 in D minor. The piece began deceptively simply, a haunting melody played in octaves, like someone humming a half-remembered song from childhood. But any pianist knew what was coming. Known among musicians simply as Reich 3, it was arguably the most technically challenging piece in the standard repertoire. As the first notes filled the studio, a subtle change came over Kostrov's face. Recognition, then disbelief flickered in his eyes. He leaned forward slightly in his chair. The piece was famous for its length, complexity, and physical demands. The pianist who had performed it for the movie Shine had called it a mountain to climb. Others described it as a piano killer. Pianists with small hands found some passages nearly impossible to play without modifications. And then there was the story every pianist knew. 20 years earlier, Vladimir Kostrov had attempted to perform Reich 3 with the Berlin Philharmonic. Halfway through the first movement, he had stopped playing. He claimed a wrist injury, though rumors swirled of inadequate preparation of a piece that had finally defeated the great maestro. He had never attempted it in public again. Sophia played on, moving from the simple opening theme into increasingly complex variations. The melody twisted and transformed, growing more elaborate with each repetition. Her small hands, which Kostrov had earlier eyed with skepticism, now moved with astonishing precision and speed. The cameras, which had been focused on capturing Kostrov's reactions as much as Sophia's playing, now swung fully to the young pianist. The director, sensing the power of what was unfolding, instructed the camera operators to hold steady on her. Sophia's body swayed slightly with the music, her face reflecting the emotional landscape of the piece, melancholy giving way to urgency, quietude erupting into passion. This was not the timid girl who had sat down at the piano earlier. This was an artist channeling something beyond herself. In the wings, Professor Abramovich watched with a mixture of pride and concern. Sophia had never mentioned preparing this piece. It wasn't part of her regular repertoire. Had she been practicing it secretly, or was she playing from memory, from hours of listening to recordings? As Sophia approached the cadenza, the extended solo section that represented the piece's most formidable challenge, a camera caught Kostrov's expression. The maestro's face had drained of color. His hands, resting on his knees, twitched unconsciously, as if playing along, as if wrestling with ghosts from his past. The cadenza was where many pianists faltered. Rachmaninoff himself, with his famously large hands that could span an interval of a 13th on the keyboard, had written two versions, the original, fiendishly difficult, and an alternate, slightly less demanding. Most pianists chose the latter. Sophia was playing the original. Her fingers became a blur across the keys, attacking the thunderous chords and lightning-fast arpeggios that seemed to require more than two hands to execute. The piano itself seemed to transform under her touch. No longer a mere instrument, but a vessel for raw emotion. The audience, which had been holding its collective breath, broke into spontaneous applause midway through the cadenza. Such a breach of classical concert etiquette would normally be considered shocking. But in this moment, it felt inevitable, like rain after days of gathering clouds. Kostrov didn't seem to notice the audience's reaction. His eyes remained fixed on Sofia's hands, on the keys, on something perhaps only he could see. The camera caught a single tear sliding down his weathered cheek before he quickly wiped it away. When Sofia struck the final chords of the cadenza and returned to the main theme of the movement, something remarkable happened. Kostrov began to nod, almost imperceptibly at first, then more definitely in time with the music. The stern lines of his face had softened. He was no longer the judge watching for mistakes, but a fellow musician caught up in the universal language they both spoke fluently. Sofia played the final bars of the first movement, with a confidence that seemed to fill the entire studio. When the last note faded, there was a moment of complete silence, that precious space between sound and recognition that musicians cherish. Then the studio erupted. People were on their feet, applauding, some wiping away tears. The host was saying something, but her words were lost in the noise. The producer had abandoned any pretense of controlling the broadcast and was clapping as hard as anyone. Sofia remained seated, hands now folded in her lap again, her face flushed with exertion and emotion. She looked toward Kostrov, waiting. The maestro sat motionless for several seconds. When he finally stood, the audience gradually quieted, sensing another dramatic moment in the making. He walked slowly to the piano, his usual commanding presence somehow altered. "Where did you learn to play that piece?" he asked, his voice different now, softer, almost private despite the microphones capturing every word. "I didn't, not formally," Sofia answered truthfully. "I've listened to recordings. I've studied the score on my own." Kostrov shook his head slightly as if trying to make sense of what he'd just witnessed. "And why did you choose that particular piece just now?" Sofia hesitated. She couldn't say the truth, that she knew it was the piece that had defeated him, that in her moment of humiliation she had reached for something that might pierce his armor. It had been an impulse, not a calculated decision. "It's a piece about struggle," she said instead, "about fighting through difficulty to find beauty." It felt right for this moment. Kostrov studied her face, perhaps looking for signs of insincerity or manipulation. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Young lady," he said, loud enough now for everyone to hear, "I owe you an apology." A murmur ran through the audience. Vladimir Kostrov apologizing? It was unprecedented. "I approached you not as a musician, but as a category, a young, provincial student who couldn't possibly understand the depths of the music she was playing." He gestured toward the piano. "I was wrong. What you just played came from true understanding." Sofia blushed, unable to meet his eyes. "Now," Kostrov continued, turning slightly to acknowledge the audience and cameras, "shall we return to Liszt with fresh ears?" Sofia nodded, relief washing over her. The confrontation had somehow transformed into collaboration, the trial into opportunity. This time when Sofia began the Hungarian Rhapsody, the difference was immediate. Her playing had a freedom that had been constricted earlier by nerves and Kostrov's overwhelming presence. The Lausanne section unfolded with a stately dignity, each note given its proper weight and space. Kostrov listened with his eyes closed, head slightly tilted. Occasionally he would nod in appreciation of a particular phrasing or dynamic choice. When Sofia transitioned into the Friska, the fast, spirited second part of the Rhapsody, he actually smiled at her handling of a particularly tricky passage. The audience, still buzzing from the emotional roller coaster of the past 20 minutes, watched in fascinated silence. The transformation was as compelling as the conflict had been, perhaps more so. When Sofia finished, the applause was immediate and genuine. The host approached, looking both relieved and exhilarated by how the segment had unfolded. "Maestro Kostrov, your evaluation?" she asked, extending her microphone toward him. Kostrov stood. "What we have witnessed today is rare," he said, his authoritative voice carrying easily through the studio. Not just technical skill, which can be developed through sufficient practice, but true musical courage. The willingness to be vulnerable, to take risks, to speak truth through sound. He turned toward Sophia. That cannot be taught. The host beamed. Well, I think it's safe to say that Sofia Petrenko will be advancing to our finals. The audience cheered their agreement. As the cameras prepared to cut away to a commercial break, Kostrov approached Sofia, who was still seated at the piano bench. The Rachmaninoff, he said quietly, just between them. You knew, didn't you? About Berlin? Sofia looked up at him, considering whether to pretend ignorance, but something in his expression told her that honesty was the only appropriate response to what they had just shared. Yes, she admitted. I knew. Kostrov nodded, neither angry nor embarrassed. Then we are even, he said with the ghost of a smile. You have humbled me as I humbled you, but perhaps we have both learned something worth knowing. As the producers signaled the end of the segment, Kostrov surprised everyone by extending his hand to Sofia. She took it, feeling the strength in his fingers, the same strength that had coaxed immortal music from pianos around the world for decades. We should talk, he said. After all this, he gestured vaguely at the cameras and lights. I have a suggestion I'd like to discuss with you. Sofia nodded, too overwhelmed to form words. As she walked off stage, Professor Abramovich rushed to meet her, his face a mixture of astonishment and pride. Sofia, he whispered urgently. Do you realize what just happened? She shook her head slightly, the events of the past hour still a blur of emotion and adrenaline. You didn't just impress him, her teacher said. You reached him. The production team scrambled to adjust to the unexpected turn of events. What had been scheduled as a standard 30-minute segment, introduction, performance, criticism, verdict, had exploded into something entirely different. The director was on the phone with network executives, who were watching the ratings spike in real time as viewers texted and called friends. Turn on your TV, you won't believe what's happening. We're extending the segment, the producer announced, rushing back to the floor. The network wants to keep this going. Sofia, Maestro Kostrov, are you willing to continue? Sofia looked to Professor Abramovich, who gave an encouraging nod. Kostrov simply shrugged, as if to say he had nowhere more important to be. The host, trying to maintain some sense of the original format, guided Sofia and Kostrov to a small seating area that had been quickly arranged at one end of the stage. The piano remained center stage, gleaming under the lights almost like a third character in the unfolding drama. So, Maestro, the host began once they were settled. You mentioned musical courage. Could you elaborate on what you saw in Sofia's performance? Kostrov leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. His initial sharpness had been replaced by something more contemplative. There are many technically gifted pianists, he said, young people with fast fingers who can play all the notes correctly. What is rare is a musician who understands that the notes are merely the skeleton of the music. The flesh, the blood, the beating heart, that comes from something deeper. He gestured toward Sofia. To play Rachmaninoff's third as she did requires not just skill, but vulnerability. The willingness to expose one's soul. Sofia listened intently, still trying to process everything that had happened. An hour ago, this man had been tearing her playing apart. Now he was talking about her soul. Sofia, the host turned to her. What were you feeling when you decided to play the Rachmaninoff piece? Sofia hesitated. The truth was complicated, a mixture of desperation, defiance, and some deeper instinct she couldn't fully name. She looked toward Kostrov, then back to the host. I felt cornered, she admitted, like a trapped animal. And when animals are trapped, they sometimes do surprising things. A small, nervous laugh escaped her. I've loved that piece for years, but never thought I was ready to play it. I guess sometimes we're more ready than we think. Kostrov nodded slowly. Fear can be paralyzing, or it can push us beyond our perceived limitations. In my experience, the greatest performances often happen when we have nothing left to lose. A shadow passed over his face, and the worst failures occur when we have too much to protect. The host, sensing the reference to Kostrov's infamous Berlin concert, tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Sofia, tell us about your background. You mentioned studying in Kharkiv on weekends? Sofia described her childhood in the village, the long bus rides, the sacrifices her parents had made, As she spoke, the camera occasionally cut to Kostrov, whose expression had softened considerably. The audience listened raptly to the story of the village girl who practiced on an old upright piano with sticky keys. "And your grandmother was a pianist too?" the host prompted. "She wanted to be," Sophia explained, "but it wasn't possible for her. Different times, different circumstances." She smiled slightly. "She always said I was playing for both of us." The host turned back to Kostrov. "Maestro, you started in similarly humble circumstances, did you not?" Something flickered in Kostrov's eyes, surprised perhaps that the host had done her research. "Yes," he acknowledged. "My father was a factory worker in Leningrad. My mother cleaned offices at night. Our apartment building had a community room with an old piano. The woman who lived next door to us gave lessons to neighborhood children for a few rubles." Sophia looked at him with new interest. Somehow she had never imagined the great Vladimir Kostrov as a child in a worker's apartment, picking out tunes on a communal piano. "Music was my escape," he continued, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if he were speaking more to himself than to the audience. "When I played, I wasn't the skinny boy with patched clothes. I was elsewhere, somewhere better." The studio was silent. This was a side of Kostrov few had ever seen. The imperious maestro suddenly human, even vulnerable. "Perhaps," he said, looking directly at Sophia now, "that's what I recognized in your playing. That same hunger." The moment hung between them, a bridge of understanding that transcended age, background, and the roles of judge and contestant. The host, skilled at her job, sensed an opportunity. "Would it be too much to ask," she began tentatively, "if the two of you might play something together?" Sophia's eyes widened. Play with Kostrov? The very idea seemed absurd, like asking a student pilot to fly alongside a Top Gun instructor. She looked at the maestro, expecting him to dismiss the suggestion outright. Instead, he appeared to be considering it. "What did you have in mind?" he asked the host. "Whatever you both feel would be appropriate," the host replied diplomatically. "Perhaps something that showcases the connection we've all witnessed developing here." Kostrov turned to Sophia. "Do you know Schubert's Fantasy in F minor for four hands?" Sophia nodded cautiously. She knew the piece, had studied it, though she'd never performed it. It was a challenging duet that required not just technical skill but deep communication between the pianists. "It's a piece about dialogue," Kostrov explained, for the benefit of the audience. "About two voices speaking, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in counterpoint. It seems appropriate." He raised an eyebrow at Sophia. "Shall we attempt it?" Before she could overthink it, Sophia heard herself saying, "Yes." The studio crew quickly rearranged the stage, bringing a second piano bench. The cameras repositioned to capture both pianists at the keyboard. In the wings, Professor Abramovich looked both proud and nervous. This was uncharted territory. As they took their places at the piano, Sophia on the right for the higher part, Kostrov on the left for the bass, the maestro leaned over slightly. "Just listen," he murmured, "and trust what you hear." They began. The piece opened with a stately theme played in unison, a musical line that was somehow both melancholy and dignified. As they moved into the variations, something extraordinary began to happen. Without rehearsal, without discussion, they found a common language. When Kostrov lingered slightly on a phrase, Sophia instinctively waited. When she added a subtle emphasis to a repeated motif, he responded in kind. The audience watched, mesmerized, as the two pianists who had begun the hour as adversaries now created something beautiful together. Their bodies swayed in unison with the music, their breathing synchronized. The four hands at the keyboard seemed to belong to a single musical consciousness. For Sophia, it was like being carried by a powerful current. She could feel Kostrov's musicality guiding her, but not dominating. He was giving her space to interpret, to add her own voice. And he was listening, really listening to what she offered in return. In the more technically demanding passages, she fought to keep up with his masterful phrasing. In the more emotionally expressive sections, she found herself leading slightly, with Kostrov following her interpretive choices with evident appreciation. When they reached the powerful climax of the piece with its thundering chords and sweeping arpeggios, they locked eyes briefly. There was a smile in his that Sophia had never seen in any photograph or video of the famous maestro. Not his public smile, practiced and somewhat cold, but something genuine and surprisingly youthful. As they brought the piece to its gentle conclusion, returning to the opening theme with new depth after the journey they'd taken, Sophia felt a profound sense of rightness. This was why she played music, for moments like this when something greater than herself flowed through her. The final chords faded. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. Then the audience erupted in applause, many rising to their feet. Sophia and Kostrov remained seated, slightly dazed, as if awakening from a shared dream. Finally, Kostrov turned to her. "You play from the heart," he said simply. It was the highest praise he could offer. The host approached, visibly moved. "I think we've all witnessed something extraordinary today," she said. "A reminder of why music matters, because it can bridge any gap, heal any wound, connect any two souls willing to listen to each other." The broadcast, originally scheduled for 1 hour, had extended well beyond its time slot. No one, not the producers, not the audience, not even the network executives frantically rearranging the evening schedule, wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. "Before we reluctantly bring this special segment to a close," the host said, "Maestro Kostrov, do you have any final thoughts for Sophia and for our viewers at home?" Kostrov stood slowly. He looked tired, but somehow lighter, as if something long carried had been set down. He addressed not Sophia, but the audience and cameras. "I have spent 50 years pursuing perfection," he said, his voice deep with emotion, chasing technical flawlessness, note-perfect performances. Along the way, I may have forgotten what I knew instinctively as a boy playing that old piano in Leningrad. That music is not about perfection. It's about connection, about courage, about truth. He turned to Sophia. "Today, this young artist reminded me of that essential fact. For that, I am grateful." As the credits began to roll, Sophia felt oddly calm. Whatever happened next, whether she won the competition or not, something important had been acknowledged both within herself and by the musical world. She had found her voice. Professor Abramovich hurried to her side as she finally left the stage. "Sophia," he said, his eyes bright with excitement, "do you have any idea what this means for your career?" Before she could answer, she felt a hand on her shoulder. "It was Kostrov, Miss Petrenko," he said formally, though his eyes were warm. "We have unfinished business to discuss, about your future." The days following the broadcast passed in a blur for Sophia. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, classmates, and people she hadn't heard from in years. Her parents called, their voices thick with emotion, telling her how the entire village had gathered in the community center to watch. Her grandmother had cried when Sophia played the Rachmaninoff. "You showed him," her father said proudly. "You showed everyone what our girl can do." Back at the academy in Kiev, Sophia found herself the center of attention. Students who had barely noticed her before now wanted to sit with her at lunch, to hear firsthand about the legendary Kostrov. Professors who had previously been briskly professional now smiled warmly when they passed her in the hallway. Professor Abramovich did his best to shield her from the worst of it, to carve out space for her to practice and prepare for the competition's final round. But even he couldn't hide his excitement about what had happened and what might happen next. "Kostrov asked for your contact information," he told her during their lesson, trying to sound casual and failing completely. "He mentioned something about discussing your interpretation of the Rachmaninoff." Sophia nodded, pretending this wasn't earth-shattering news. Inside, though, she felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Since that day in the studio, she'd replayed their duet in her mind countless times. The way they'd breathed together, the unspoken communication that had flowed between them through the music. It had been like nothing she'd ever experienced. A week after the broadcast, as Sophia was practicing late in one of the academy's smaller rooms, there was a knock at the door. She called out, "Come in," expecting the janitor who usually let her know when the building was closing. Instead, Vladimir Kostrov himself stood in the doorway. Sophia jumped to her feet, nearly knocking over the piano bench. "Maestro, I didn't know you were in Kyiv." Kostrov looked different somehow, less imposing in simple dark pants and a gray sweater, his silver hair slightly mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. He carried a worn leather briefcase. "I had business at the Philharmonic," he said, stepping into the small practice room. And I thought we might continue our conversation. Sophia gestured awkwardly to the room's only other chair. Please sit. Kostrov settled himself, placing his briefcase on his lap. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with the echo of their last encounter. Finally, Kostrov cleared his throat. I've been thinking about your playing, he said, getting straight to the point as was his habit. Particularly the Rachmaninoff. It was illuminating. Sophia waited, unsure where this was going. You know, of course, that I never finished playing that piece publicly, he continued, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond her. The story has become something of a legend in musical circles. Yes, Sophia admitted. I'd heard about Berlin. Kostrov's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. The official story was that I injured my wrist during the first movement. The truth was more complicated. He looked directly at her now. I simply wasn't ready. Not technically, I could play all the notes. But something else was missing. I didn't understand the piece, not really. He unlatched his briefcase and drew out a worn, obviously well-used musical score. Sophia recognized it immediately. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. This has traveled with me for 20 years, Kostrov said, running his hand over the cover. I've studied it, made notes in the margins, tried to unlock its secrets. And yet when I heard you play it, you who had never formally studied it, I understood what I'd been missing all these years. Sophia felt her cheeks warm. I just played it the way it felt right to me. Exactly. Kostrov leaned forward. You weren't burdened by tradition, by the weight of all the famous interpretations that came before. You played it as if the ink were still wet on the page, as if Rachmaninoff had just composed it for you. He held out the score to her. I want you to have this. Sophia stared at the offered music, understanding the significance of the gesture. I couldn't possibly— Please, he insisted. It would mean a great deal to me. Slowly, she accepted the score, opening it carefully. The pages were filled with penciled notes in several languages, diagrams of hand positions, circled passages with question marks. 20 years of a master pianist's thoughts and struggles with this monumental piece. Thank you, she said simply, knowing no other words could capture what she felt. Kostrov nodded once, satisfied. Then he shifted gears. Now about your future. Have you considered what comes next after the academy? Sophia blinked at the sudden change of topic. I was hoping to audition for graduate programs abroad. If I could get a scholarship. You could, Kostrov agreed. But I have another proposal. He straightened in his chair, his manner becoming more formal. I'm starting a masterclass series next year. 6 young pianists, intensive study for 6 months, concluding with a European tour. I'd like you to be one of them. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Kostrov's masterclasses were legendary, exclusive, demanding, and career-making for those selected. And notoriously difficult to get into. But I'm not— there are students with much more impressive resumes, she protested. Resumes. Kostrov waved dismissively. What do they tell me about music? About heart? I've heard you play. That tells me everything I need to know. He fixed her with those piercing blue eyes. Will you accept? Sophia thought of her tiny room at the academy, of her parents who had scraped together every coin to give her this chance, of her grandmother who had given up her own dreams but nurtured Sophia's. She thought of the village where she'd grown up, so far from the concert halls of Europe. Yes, she said, her voice stronger than she expected. I accept. Thank you. Kostrov nodded again as if her answer was exactly what he'd anticipated. Good. We begin in September in Vienna. He stood, preparing to leave, then paused. One more thing. The finals of your competition are next week, correct? Yes, on Thursday. What will you play? Sophia had been planning to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a piece she knew inside and out, but suddenly that seemed too safe, too expected. I'm not sure yet, she admitted. A ghost of a smile touched Kostrov's lips. Whatever you choose, play it with the same courage you showed that day in the studio. That's all the advice I can give you. He moved toward the door, then turned back. And Sophia? Yes? After the competition, whatever the outcome, remember that a true musician's journey never ends. There is always another piece to learn, another depth to reach for. His eyes seemed distant for a moment. It's what keeps us young. This constant becoming. With that, he was gone. leaving Sophia alone with the precious score and a head full of dreams that suddenly seemed possible. The following Thursday, Sophia walked onto the stage for the final round of the competition. The judges, 3 renowned musicians, though not Kostrov this time, sat in the front row. The audience was larger than before, word having spread about the girl who had stood up to the maestro. Sophia took her place at the piano, adjusting the bench precisely. When the head judge nodded for her to begin, she took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. She had decided to play Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 again, the very piece Kostrov had criticized her for. But this time she played it differently, not trying to impress anyone, not trying to be perfect, but simply telling a story through her fingers, a story about struggle and triumph, about finding one's voice against all odds. When she finished, the audience rose as one, applauding wildly. Sophia bowed, her heart full. 3 days later, they announced she had won. 1 year passed. On a crisp autumn evening, Sophia found herself backstage at Royal Festival Hall in London, about to make her professional debut with the London Philharmonic. Her hands were cold, as they always were before a performance. She rubbed them together, trying to calm her racing heart. The piece she would play? Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, of course. She had spent the past 6 months studying it intensely under Kostrov's guidance, discovering new layers, new possibilities within the notes. Kostrov himself would conduct tonight, a rare honor he had bestowed on only a handful of young soloists throughout his long career. Just before they were due to go on stage, he appeared at her side, immaculate in his conductor's tails. "Nervous?" he asked, though he surely knew the answer. "Terrified," Sophia admitted with a small laugh. Kostrov reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "I have something for you." Sophia unwrapped it carefully. Inside was an old photograph in a simple frame. It showed a weathered upright piano against a wall papered with faded flowers. Seated at the piano was a young girl, maybe 8 years old, her face serious with concentration. "My grandmother," Kostrov explained quietly. "She saved for 3 years to buy that piano. She couldn't play herself, but she was determined that I would have the chance." He touched the frame gently. "I keep this with me always to remember where I came from. Tonight I thought you might like to have it nearby to remember why we do this." Sophia felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. The stage manager appeared. 2 minutes, please." Kostrov straightened, becoming once again the maestro the world knew. "Ready?" Sophia nodded, placing the photograph carefully on top of her folded coat. As they walked toward the stage, Kostrov leaned down slightly. "Remember what I told you in Kiev. Courage, always courage," Sophia smiled. "And heart?" "Yes," he agreed as they stepped into the lights. "Always heart." The audience applauded as they took their places, the legendary conductor and the young pianist who had reminded him of music's true purpose. Sophia settled at the piano, flexed her fingers, and waited for Kostrov's signal. When it came, she began to play, sending the simple, haunting melody of Rachmaninoff's opening theme out into the hushed hall. This time she played not from memory or from the score, but from somewhere deeper, a place of gratitude for all the hands that had helped her reach this moment, and all the hearts that had believed in her along the way. In the front row, watching with pride, sat Sophia's parents and grandmother, their faces shining, and in her mind, as her fingers danced across the keys, Sophia felt the presence of all those who had come before her. Village music teachers and great composers, struggling students and legendary maestros, united in the endless conversation that is music.